The silence in that elevator was so thick I could hear my own heartbeat. "She works in the mailroom," my brother said to his colleague, nodding toward me without even looking. "Don't worry about her." I looked straight ahead at the closing doors and said nothing. That was 3 years before everything changed. Before the day my brother stood in a conference room on the 14th floor of the Dirksen Senate office building and watched a U.S. senator shake my hand like I was someone worth knowing. But I'm getting ahead of myself. You need to understand what came before. My name is Claire Weston. I grew up in Raleigh, North Carolina, the youngest of 3 kids. My mother worked double shifts at a pediatric clinic. My father drove trucks cross-country until his knees gave out, and after that, he drove a school bus. We were not poor exactly, but we were the kind of family where the dishwasher was always broken and nobody fixed it because there was always something more urgent. My brother Kevin was 8 years older than me. By the time I was in middle school, he was already in college on a partial lacrosse scholarship, calling home every Sunday like clockwork, and my parents talked about him the way people talk about a painting they're proud to have hung in the entryway. I was not the painting in the entryway. I was more like the coat rack nobody notices until they need it. Kevin was charming. That was the word everyone used. He had a smile that made people lean in, the kind of ease around strangers that I spent my entire adolescence trying to understand and couldn't. He went to law school. He married a woman named Trish, who had straight blonde hair and strong opinions about which neighborhoods were worth living in. He moved to D.C. He became a legislative counsel for a senior senator from our state. I studied political science at UNC Chapel Hill, then got a master's in public policy from Georgetown on a merit fellowship. Nobody in my family sent flowers when I got the fellowship. My mother called and said, "That's wonderful, baby," and I could hear the TV in the background. I don't say that to make her a villain. She was tired. She had been tired for 30 years. I understood. I just noticed. After Georgetown, I took a junior analyst position at a small government affairs office in D.C. The pay was modest. The work was not modest at all. We were buried in legislative research, regulatory filings, briefing documents. I was 25 years old and regularly staying at the office past 10 at night. I didn't mind. I loved the work the way some people love a difficult person. It asked a lot of me, and I kept showing up anyway. Kevin's office was in the same building where I had a meeting once, early on, before I knew enough to be strategic about things like that. I saw him in the lobby. He was with 2 colleagues in expensive suits, laughing at something on someone's phone. I waved. He saw me. He said, loud enough for his colleagues to hear, "Oh, that's my little sister. She does research work." Then he turned back to the phone. His colleague glanced at me briefly. That particular glance that takes a full inventory of a person in under 1 second and files them under not relevant, and I smiled like everything was fine and walked to my meeting. I cried in a bathroom stall afterward, which I'm not embarrassed about now. At 25, feeling invisible is a physical sensation. It settles somewhere between your sternum and your throat, and it just sits there. That was the beginning of a pattern that would go on for years. Kevin came home for Christmas that first year I was in D.C., and at dinner he told our parents about a bill he'd helped draft language for, and my mother listened with both hands wrapped around her coffee mug and her full attention on his face. I had spent that fall helping research a bipartisan infrastructure amendment. When I mentioned it, casually, just wanting to be part of the conversation, Kevin said, "Oh, analysts do a lot of background support work. Important stuff, but behind the scenes." He said it kindly. That was the part that made it worse. He said it like he was explaining my own job to me, like he was being generous. My father nodded and said, "That's good, Claire Bear. Steady work." Steady work. Like I was stocking shelves. The years moved fast the way your 20s do when you're working constantly and sleeping not enough. I changed jobs. I moved from the government affairs office to a fellowship at a think tank focused on transportation policy, then from there to a full-time senior researcher position that came with a small team of my own and a salary that finally let me stop doing the math before every grocery run. I published 3 white papers. One of them got cited in a Senate hearing, not my hearing, just a hearing, but still, my name was in the record. I remember printing the page out and sitting with it for a long time. I did not tell Kevin, I'm not sure why. Have it, maybe. There's a kind of protection in keeping your wins to yourself when you've learned that sharing them doesn't produce the reaction you hoped for. Kevin's career was advancing too. He had moved up, was now senior counsel to the senator, was at every important event, photographed shaking hands with the right people. When we were home at the same time, he talked about access and influence and relationships in Washington in a way that subtly implied I was still somewhere in the minor leagues. Once he said, over Thanksgiving, the thing about real policy work is you have to be in the room. You can't change anything from the outside. He was not talking to me specifically, he was talking to the table. But I was the only other person at that table who worked in policy. I smiled. I passed the sweet potatoes. The breaking point, if you want to call it that, came on a Tuesday in March, about 2 years ago. The senator Kevin worked for was holding a roundtable on federal infrastructure funding. It was a big deal. Closed-door meeting, senior staffers, a handful of outside experts. I had been invited as one of those outside experts. Not as support staff, not as background research, as a presenter. My transportation policy team had spent 8 months developing a funding framework for rural broadband infrastructure that had gotten traction in ways I didn't fully expect. The right people had read the right white paper at the right time. And suddenly, I was being asked to present our methodology to people who actually make decisions. That morning, I put on the navy blazer I'd bought specifically for important meetings, and I drove to the Dirksen building and I signed in at the security desk and I clipped my visitor badge to my lapel. Kevin's office was on the 8th floor. The round table was on the 14th. I did not plan to run into him, but Washington is a small town dressed up in a big city's clothing, and the elevators in that building are slow, and when the doors opened on the 8th floor, there he was, with 2 colleagues. Again, he looked at my badge, then at my face, then at my badge again. Claire, what are you doing here? Round table on federal funding, I said. 14th floor. He processed this. I watched him do it. Oh, he said. Are you helping with this setup? One of his colleagues, a young man with a tight smile, looked at his phone. The other one, a woman I didn't recognize, glanced at me with polite disinterest. I felt the old familiar thing rise up in my chest. That silence, that urge to shrink, to say something self-deprecating, to make it easier for him to not have to revise his understanding of me. I didn't. I'm presenting, I said. I've been invited as a subject matter expert on rural broadband infrastructure funding. Kevin laughed, not a mean laugh, an uncertain one. You're presenting to the roundtable. Yes, Senator Barfield's roundtable. Yes, Kevin. The elevator doors were starting to close. I stepped forward and held them with my hand. I looked at him steadily. I was 31 years old, and I had earned every single credential I was about to walk into that room with, and I was done making myself smaller so that he could stay the size he'd always imagined himself to be. The 14th floor, I said again, and let the doors close. The round table had 11 people around the table. I knew 2 of them by name before I walked in. I knew the rest by reputation. My section ran 40 minutes. I fielded questions I had been preparing answers to for months, and a few I hadn't prepared for, and I answered all of them without flinching. Senator Barfield, who is not my senator, who had no particular reason to be warm toward me, asked me afterward if I had ever considered coming in-house. We could use someone who thinks the way you think, she said. I said I was honored and that I would consider it, which was the professional thing to say, and my heart was going about 120 beats per minute. What I did not expect was what happened in the lobby afterward. Kevin was there. He had clearly positioned himself there. He had no particular reason to be in the main lobby at 4 in the afternoon. He was talking to a colleague, but he was watching the elevator bank, and when I came out, he stepped toward me. Hey, he said. How'd it go? Well, I said. Senator Barfield said something about your work, he said carefully. Apparently she mentioned it to Martinez, one of the senior staffers, and he mentioned it to me. I waited. She said, he stopped. Started again. She said you were the sharpest voice in the room. I didn't say anything. Kevin looked at the floor for a moment. He had our father's jaw and our mother's eyes, and he was 40 years old. And for the first time in my life, he looked genuinely uncertain in my presence. I didn't know, he said finally, about any of it. The think tank, the white papers. Mom mentioned something once, but I didn't. He stopped again. I should have asked. Yes, I said, you should have. He nodded. There was nothing else to add right then, and we both knew it, and I walked out of the building into the cold March air, and I stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, and I didn't cry this time. I just breathed. That was not the end of the story, though. The end came later in a different way than I expected. 6 months after the roundtable, I accepted a position as Director of Policy Research at a federal transportation agency. It was the kind of job that comes with a title on the door and a budget you're responsible for, and meetings at the White House Office of Management and Budget. Real meetings. The kind Kevin had spent his career orbiting. My mother cried when I told her. Good crying. The kind where she had to set the phone down for a second to collect herself, and when she came back she said, I always knew. I want you to know that. I always knew you had it in you. I know, Mom, I said, and I did know. But it still mattered to hear. Kevin called that same evening. I'm proud of you, he said. I need you to know that I mean that. I believed him. I also believed that he had spent years not meaning to diminish me and had done it anyway, which is its own kind of thing to sit with. Pride and pattern can exist in the same person. That's something I've had to learn. I took the job. I moved into an office with a window that looks out over the Capitol Dome on clear days, which is not nothing, and I will never pretend it's nothing. There is an intern on my team this year. A young woman named Paige, 23, brilliant. The kind of quiet that other people misread as smallness. Last week, she submitted a memo that was the best analysis of freight rail funding gaps I have seen from anyone at any level. I told her so directly. I told her I was going to make sure the right people read it. I told her to put her name at the top in a font size that commands attention. She looked at me like she wasn't sure she was allowed to do that. Put your name on it, I said again. All of it. Everything you build from here. You don't get to be invisible anymore. She smiled. The uncertain, almost believing kind of smile, and I recognized it completely. I went back to my office and sat for a while, looking at the dome through the window. My father called me last Christmas. He's retired now, knees still bad, watches a lot of cable news and has opinions about it. He called to say he'd seen something in the local Raleigh paper. Apparently, the agency's infrastructure report had been covered in the News and Observer, and my name was in the third paragraph. Claire Bear, he said, and his voice had something in it I hadn't heard before. Something like awe a little bit. Something like realizing. Hi, Dad, I said. Why didn't you tell us how big this was? I thought about that. I thought about the Christmas I mentioned the amendment and Kevin explained my job to me. I thought about the steady work comment. I thought about 25 years old in a bathroom stall. I'm telling you now, I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I want to come visit. See your office. See where you work. I'd like that, I said. He came in February. I met him at Union Station in my work coat, the gray one I bought the year the salary finally made it possible. And we took the metro to the agency building and I signed him in at the security desk and the guard handed him a visitor badge and said, She's one of our directors. You must be proud. My father looked at the guard, then at me, then at the badge in his hand. Yes, he said, and his voice was rougher than usual. I am. We walked through the lobby and I showed him the elevator bank and the directory with my name on it. We went up to my floor and I showed him my office and the window and the dome in the gray February sky. He stood at the window with his hands in his jacket pockets and didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, You did this yourself. I had help, I said. Good professors, good colleagues, a couple of people who saw something and said so at the right time. But mostly yourself? I thought about all the late nights in the bathroom stall and the elevator and the Christmas dinners and the steady work comment and the years of keeping my wins to myself because sharing them hurt too much. Mostly myself, I agreed. He nodded like he was storing that somewhere important, like it was something he needed to carry correctly from here on out. Kevin was there at Easter, the next time we were all home together in Raleigh. He was between projects, a little quieter than usual. At dinner, he asked me about the agency, real questions, the kind that meant he'd read something and prepared. I answered them honestly. After dinner, we sat on the back porch like we used to when we were kids, and the air still had that early spring bite to it, and he said, I owe you more than an apology. You don't owe me anything dramatic, I said. I underestimated you for years, and I said it out loud in front of people. Yeah, I said. You did. I'm sorry. I looked at the yard. The crabapple tree we grew up climbing was still there, smaller than I remembered it, the way everything from childhood shrinks when you go back. I know you are, I said. We sat there for a while. It wasn't fixed, not completely, not in the way of movies where one conversation resolves 20 years, but it was a start, and I have learned that a start is not nothing. A start is sometimes everything. I think about Paige a lot, about what it means to be the person who says put your name on it to someone who was never told to. I didn't have that person, not early on. I had to become her for myself first, which is harder and takes longer. But I got there. My name is on the directory, on the reports, in the record. I'm not invisible anymore, and I don't intend to be again. I used to think the hardest part was the work itself. The late nights, the research that went nowhere, the drafts I rewrote 6 times before anyone read them once. But looking back now, I think the hardest part was something quieter than that. It was learning to keep going when the people who were supposed to see you, really see you, looked right through you instead. Kevin never set out to diminish me. I believe that now in a way I couldn't believe it at 25. He wasn't calculating about it. He just had a picture of me in his head that he'd drawn a long time ago, and he kept referring back to it instead of looking at the actual person standing in front of him. That's not malice. It's something more ordinary and in some ways harder to forgive. It's indifference dressed up as familiarity. What I've come to understand is that the way people treat you is often less about who you are and more about who they've decided you are. And there's almost nothing you can say to change that picture. You can argue, you can explain, you can perform your credentials like a recital nobody asked for. Or you can do the harder, slower thing. You can just keep building, keep showing up, keep doing work that is impossible to ignore. Not to prove something to them, to prove something to yourself first. That's what those years actually were. Not a long wait for Kevin to notice. A long process of me becoming someone I could respect. The Senate roundtable didn't make me credible. The 8 months of work that went into it did. The director title didn't make me capable. Every report, every late night, every question I answered without flinching made me capable. The recognition was just the part other people could see. The real thing had been there for years. There's a straightforward logic to how this all played out, and I don't think it requires anything mystical to explain it. When you put serious effort into serious work over a long enough period of time, you become someone who can do serious things. And when you become that person, the world eventually has to respond to who you actually are instead of who someone decided you were at a Christmas dinner 15 years ago. It doesn't happen fast. It's not dramatic when it's happening, but it compounds the way anything does when you're consistent about it. What I want for Paige and for anyone who recognizes something of themselves in this story is to get to the compounding part sooner. Not by rushing, but by refusing to let someone else's limited imagination become the ceiling on your own. Put your name on your work. Don't shrink the accomplishment to make the room more comfortable. The people worth being around will not think less of you for taking up the right amount of space. I'm not invisible anymore. That's not luck. That's a decade of deciding, quietly and without much fanfare, that I wasn't going to be.